4 winners. No tiebreaker. That was Eurovision, 1969. A scoring chaos so embarrassing the organizers changed the rules soon after, unwilling to let it happen twice. Lost slightly in the confusion was the teenager from Glasgow who'd just become, overnight, one of the most recognizable singers in Britain. It read like the tidiest of fairy tales. Humble beginnings, an unlikely voice, a crown handed to her before she'd fully grown up. The press adored it, and mostly left it there. What they didn't dwell on was a marriage she entered far too young, a string of men who quietly ran her career for her, and years spent clawing back control over a life that had never quite felt like her own. The real story, it turns out, was never really about the song. Marie MacDonald McLaughlin Lowry was born in 1948 in the Denniston district of Glasgow, one of 4 children in a tenement flat where money was tight and ambition was not encouraged so much as tolerated. Her father worked at the market, her mother kept house, and nobody in that household had ever so much as met a professional singer, let alone raised one. But the girl had a voice, and by the time she was in her early teens, everyone on her street seemed to know it. She sang at family gatherings and local halls, anywhere that would have her, with a raw, husky power that was startling coming out of someone so small and so young. Talent scouts, when they finally came looking, weren't expecting Glasgow. They certainly weren't expecting a 14-year-old. A local music manager spotted her at a school dance in 1963 and moved quickly. Within months, she had a new name, Lulu, blunt and easy to shout from a crowd, and a record deal that would have seemed like fantasy to her parents a year earlier. Her first single, a cover of the Isley Brothers' Shout, was recorded when she was barely 15, and it shot her into the British charts almost overnight. It was the kind of rags-to-fame origin story the papers adored, and they printed it exactly that way. A fearless working-class girl, discovered practically by accident, now belting out hits on national television. Rarely mentioned was how fast it had all happened, or how little control a teenager actually had over the machine that now surrounded her. Contracts were signed by adults on her behalf. Decisions about songs, image, and schedule were made in rooms she wasn't invited into. Still, for a while, none of that seemed to matter. She toured relentlessly, appeared in films, and built a public persona so instantly recognizable that within a few years, Lulu needed no last name at all. Success, at 15 and 16 and 17, looked uncomplicated from the outside. A girl who'd been handed the world. What nobody printed, not yet, was the price of being handed it, quite so young. By the mid-1960s, Lulu was no longer a novelty act from Glasgow, but a fixture of British pop, and the hits kept arriving fast enough to disguise how young she still was. There were film roles, most famously alongside Sidney Poitier in To Sir with Love in 1967, whose title song became a #1 hit in America and made her, for a moment, one of the most bankable young stars in the English-speaking world. Then came Madrid and the strange, chaotic triumph of Eurovision 1969. 4 countries tied for first place that year, Lulu's Boom Bang a Bang among them. A result so awkward that organizers scrapped the format soon after rather than risk it happening twice. At not yet 21, she'd been a hit singer, a film star, and now a Eurovision winner, all inside a few short years. If appearances were to be believed, it was a fairy tale with impeccable timing. The tenement girl, now dining with royalty, singing for presidents, her face on magazine covers from London to New York. And in some ways it was exactly that. She had genuinely earned the acclaim, on talent alone, in an industry that rarely let working-class girls keep any real say in their own careers. But behind the glittering schedule, something had already begun to crack. In January of that same year, 1969, Lulu married Maurice Gibb of the Bee Gees, a whirlwind courtship that moved from introduction to wedding in barely a matter of months. The papers covered it as pop royalty uniting with pop royalty. 2 dazzling young stars, perfectly suited to one another. The truth, as she would only admit decades later, was considerably less tidy. She was 20 years old, exhausted from a decade of being managed by other people's decisions, and she stepped into marriage the same way she'd stepped into fame, quickly, and without very much of the choosing being genuinely her own. Friends close to the couple would later suggest that neither of them was, in truth, quite ready for what they'd agreed to. For now, though, the cameras saw only the wedding, the crown, the #1 records. The unraveling, when it came, would happen well out of the spotlight's reach. The marriage to Maurice Gibb, glossy as it looked in the papers, began coming apart almost as quickly as it had come together. Both of them were still barely into their 20s, both already exhausted by fame that had arrived faster than either could really absorb, and both, by most accounts, far too young and far too busy to build the kind of partnership a marriage actually requires. Gibb's own career with the Bee Gees kept him touring and recording at a punishing pace, and Lulu's schedule was hardly gentler. Television specials, film offers, a steady stream of singles that the label expected her to keep delivering on time. There was, by her own later admission, very little space left in either of their lives for each other. What made it harder still was a pattern she'd lived with since she was 14, decisions being made around her rather than by her. Managers picked her songs. Producers picked her image. Even now, married and internationally famous, she found herself again taking direction rather than giving it, this time from a husband whose own career simply took precedence, almost by default, over hers. She began, quietly at first, to push back. She experimented with a more mature sound, moved away from the bubblegum image that had made her famous as a teenager, and started asking, more insistently than before, to have a say in what she recorded and how she was marketed. It did not go over smoothly. The industry that had built Lulu the brand was not especially interested in letting the woman underneath it start making her own choices. By the early 1970s, the cracks in the marriage had become impossible to paper over for the cameras any longer. Friends close to the couple would later describe two people who had simply grown in different directions, too fast, with too little time spent actually together to notice it happening. The public still saw pop royalty. Privately, Lulu had already begun quietly plotting her way out. The divorce from Maurice Gibb finally came through in 1973, 4 years almost to the month after their headline-grabbing wedding. The press, ever fond of a tidy contrast, ran it as the sad end of a pop fairy tale. Lulu herself, for the most part, kept her counsel, a habit she'd carry through most of her private life, letting the tabloids fill in whatever blanks she declined to. She did not stay unattached for long, though this time, the choice, by her own account, was very much her own. In 1976, she met John Frieda, then a rising young hairdresser, who would go on to build an international hair care empire bearing his name. Within a few years they had a son together and, in 1977, married quietly, a stark contrast to the whirlwind, camera-ready ceremony of her first wedding. For a while it looked as though she had finally found the ordinary domestic life the tabloids assumed she must secretly want. She stepped back from relentless touring, focused on raising her son, and let her recording career slow to something closer to a normal pace, rather than the frantic schedule that had defined her teens and 20s. But normal, for a woman who had been a public figure since she was 14, rarely stayed simple for long. Industry insiders would later note that even during this quieter domestic period, she was fielding offers, negotiating comebacks, and quietly resisting pressure from record labels who wanted the old Lulu back, bubbly, chart-friendly, and controllable, rather than the more assertive woman she had become. By the early 1980s, the marriage to Frieda too had run its course, ending in divorce in 1991 after years of the two increasingly leading separate professional lives. What the papers had once painted as a happy ending would turn out to be only another chapter, one more attempt, like the others, to build a settled life inside a career that had never once allowed her to fully settle. By the 2020s, the woman the public had watched for 6 decades still seemed, from the outside, exactly as she always had. Chatty, resilient, impossible not to like. She had scored a genuine chart comeback in 1993 with Relight My Fire, alongside Take That, and had gone on notching hits and headline slots deep into a career most artists would have envied after half as many years. But in 2025, that polished public surface finally split open. Lulu published a memoir, If Only You Knew, and in it, she admitted to things, in her own words, she had been told not to say for the better part of her life. On television to promote the book, She confessed she'd had to go into therapy simply to process the act of finally speaking about them. The reveal was not the scandal the tabloids had spent decades hunting for. There was no secret lover, no libel suit, no royal cousin demanding satisfaction in a courtroom. The real story, when it finally surfaced, was quieter and in some ways more startling. A woman who had spent her entire adult life performing cheerfulness on command had been privately fighting alcoholism for years, a struggle she kept almost entirely hidden even from people close to her, before eventually finding recovery. "People think they know Lulu," a friend had once told her, "but nobody knows you." It was, she admitted, close to the truth. Raised by a mother who believed you simply did not air your troubles in public, she had built an entire persona, bright, bubbly, endlessly game, specifically so nobody would ever have to look past it. So, if the public had spent 60 years imagining the wildest chapter of her life was the failed marriages, the industry battles, the relentless schedule, they had been looking in the wrong place entirely. The real crisis had been happening quietly, off camera, for years, hidden behind the very persona that made her famous in the first place. The most striking part of it all wasn't the drinking itself, but how completely she managed to hide it. For years, decade after decade, in front of cameras, on chat show sofas, at award ceremonies and Saturday night specials, Lulu performed exactly the character the public wanted. Warm, unstoppable, endlessly delighted to be there. Friends who knew her socially would later admit they'd had no real sense of what was happening underneath that performance. She has since described the split quite plainly herself. There was Lulu, bright and bubbly and easy to love, and there was the private woman behind her, who she has said was also happy, but anxious, sometimes sad, and, in her own word, a fighter. For most of her life, she didn't fully understand where one ended and the other began. "I love Lulu," she has said. "Why wouldn't I love Lulu? Look at what she brought to me." But there came a point, by her own account, when the persona started to take over the person who'd built it. The shame, she has admitted, ran deep enough that for years she couldn't bring herself to look directly at what was happening, to admit, even privately, that she had become someone dependent on alcohol to get through it. It took her the better part of a decade of quiet recovery, working the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, before she felt able to call herself sober at all, let alone say so out loud. And even then, she very nearly didn't. Raised by a mother who believed firmly that you did not, under any circumstances, wash your dirty linen in public, Lulu carried that instinct into adulthood almost intact. It took a shift in the landscape, as she later put it, a culture finally more willing to hear these stories, before she judged it safe to tell hers. The tabloids of the 1960s had gone looking for scandal in her love life, and found, at most, a string of failed marriages. The real story, the one that had been sitting quietly underneath all of it, was one of survival, and it had taken Lulu almost 60 years to feel able to tell it herself. The recovery, once it finally took hold, did not slow her down. If anything, it seemed to free something up. Sobriety became the foundation for one of the more improbable second acts in British pop. In 1993, 30 years after Shout first put her on the charts as a 15-year-old, Lulu teamed up with Take That on Relight My Fire and landed straight back at #1. It was not a nostalgia act trading on an old name. It was, by most accounts, a genuinely new following, discovering a woman they'd assumed belonged to their parents' generation. The comeback kept going. She scored top 10 hits in the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, and the 2000s. 5 consecutive decades. An achievement almost no other female artist of her generation can claim. She sang the theme for a Bond film, hosted her own BBC series, duetted with Bowie, Bassie, and Al Green, and kept working at a pace that would have exhausted performers half her age. What had changed, those closest to her would say, was not her ambition, but her relationship to it. For the first time since she was 14, she was making choices from a place of genuine clarity rather than exhaustion or obligation. She stopped chasing the approval of an industry that had spent decades trying to keep her small and biddable, and started simply making the music and the appearances that actually interested her. By her 70s, she was still headlining, turning up at Glastonbury alongside Ronnie Wood and Rod Stewart, and, by every account, having more fun on that stage than performers a quarter her age. The girl who had once been handed a stage name, a contract, and a persona she didn't fully choose had, decades later, finally built a version of fame that was entirely her own to run. Today, well into her 70s, Lulu remains one of the last working links to an entire era of British pop. One of the only artists alive who can say she shared a stage, a chart, or a duet with everyone from the Beatles' contemporaries to Take That, from Bowie to Bassie to Al Green. Her son from her marriage to John Frieda has grown into adulthood largely out of the spotlight, a small mercy she has said she's grateful for, given how little privacy she herself was ever allowed. She still tours, she still records, and in 2025, decades after the tabloids first went digging for a scandal in her love life, she finally handed them one they hadn't been looking for. Not an affair, not a feud, but a memoir laying bare the addiction and shame she'd spent almost her entire adult life concealing behind a smile the public adored. It cost her something to tell it. She has said plainly that the process sent her back into therapy, that unpicking a lifetime of things she'd been told not to say felt, in her words, like being let out of jail. But she told it anyway, at an age when most performers would simply let the polished version stand. That, in the end, may be the more remarkable story than any of the marriages, the Eurovision tie, or the whirlwind fame that arrived when she was barely a teenager. A girl handed a stage name before she'd finished growing up, spent 60 years being managed, marketed, and misunderstood, and then, quietly, on her own terms, finally took the story back. The wild child of 1969 turned out, in the end, to be the one still standing, still singing, and finally telling the truth. I've been Chester. See you next time. Cheers.